All right. Well, I don't recall if I've ever. This is Advent slash. This is the Advent celebration of the Jesse tree, or Jesse tree. And so, what we're going to do over the next 3 weeks as we lead up to Christmas is we're going to tonight. I want to talk about Advent briefly in general. We've talked about that on other occasions and in other videos. I believe you can find that information in more detail. But tonight we're going to talk a little bit more about the Jesse tree, and not so much the history of it, a little bit of it, and what it does and how it functions, but more just so the actual stories. And as I said earlier before we hit record, uh, you can find this document on our website for last week's post. I'll probably put it in this week's too, if just as a reminder. But in each of these, there are six. On each of these pages, there are six symbols, and each of these symbols represent a part of the narrative or the story of God's redemption of humanity and sort of the journey that God took with humanity from creation in Christ to all the way to the birth of Christ incarnate. And it will get to what it is and how it functions in a minute. But what we're going to do is for each of we have 3 sessions. There are about 24 of these, depending on the one I used as 24, but other versions have a little more, a little less. You can do this all the way from Thanksgiving. There's lots of versions out there. This is a version I created, so these are drawings that I made on just a word, a graphic design program for my family years ago, and I've just continued to use them. I'll show you in a few minutes even some of the paintings that we've done and some of the ornaments that we've done over the years, just to kind of give you an idea. But we'll get into that. But what we're going to do after that is each of these has a chapter associated with them. And my thought was is that we would read 8 chapters, and someone else can read them. We read them one another and listen, but that we read the 8 chapters. So we're kind of going to basically do three mega sessions of the Jesse Tree line of symbols and stories, as opposed to doing them daily. But what I would encourage you to do is print these out. And when we do these, when we read the chapters, for those not reading, I would encourage you to listen with the ear of what are you hearing, what words are coming out, and you could even write them on a sheet of paper, or if you print this out later, you can put them on the back of this. But the goal of this would be that you could color this, and then you could stick them on your refrigerator. We put them on this particular one we usually do every year, and we put it on like the in between doorway, like this. There's like that little sill that goes on the wall that juts out. So we often line one side and one the other, but we have multiple versions of this in our home. So, but I love everything, and I'll talk about a little bit more about why I think it's amazing in terms of formation and all that sort of stuff. But this is sort of the plan. We're going to do 8 of these, or we'll see how far we go today. But we'll cover all 24 symbols over the next 3 weeks. So before I get into Advent, is there any thoughts or questions?
Uh, we had a service at my church Sunday night, what is kind of a traditional service that you may have been involved with, lessons and carols.
Yes,
And that traced a lot of the Old Testament history and prophecies also.
it
I mean,
is.
it doesn't do 24 of them, but there were 9 readings, I think.
There
And
are, yeah, and lessons and carols is one of the many ways that, I mean, and usually that's using the carols to kind of guide. I think the challenge that you find often in that, in modern day expressions of that, is that those carols are often Christmas carols.
right.
And in a true Jesse Tree Advent sort of situation, we don't. You would save Christmas for the 12 days of Christmas, and you would keep Advent and Christmas separate.
Yeah. Okay.
So depending on the expression of that, and I can't see without seeing the actual liturgy itself or the actual song selections, I wouldn't comment on that. But there are those who are purist in terms of the Advent season is the Advent season and the Christmas season is the Christmas season. Would I would say that the lessons and carols, depending on what lessons they use, could tend itself towards Christmas blurred with Advent or purely Advent, and it's possible to do sort of a hymn type thing that moves through that.
Mhm.
But no, though honestly, I think anything that centers you, anything that helps you reflect, I mean, hearing a Christmas Carol before Christmas doesn't bother me. It's just, it's all part of a season that of reflection, and I think it's better to have a little reflection than no reflection, I guess is what I
Hmm.
would. So the larger pic. Anything else? Did you want to add anything else to that?
No, that's good.
We got to get your camera working too. It's nicer to see
I know.
your faces rather than that blank screen.
Talk to Jim. He's the tech guy.
Yeah.
Not a very good one.
Well, that's scary. Uh, so, as I've talked about in times past, Christmas is an invented holiday. A lot of times people like to think Christmas is like some godly ordained thing, and it really wasn't. It goes back to the time of Constantine in the mid 300s after Constantine became a Christian, and then um, um, he ushered in a sort of Christianity in somewhat of a forceful way. And one of the challenges of that time, and really predates so many of the celebrations we have in Christmas, predate the actual existence of the day of Christmas, of when we celebrate Christ's incarnation. But what he was doing is basically taking the season of solstice that had a lot of social inversion and debauchery and indulgence and drunkenness and fornication, all attached to the season of the solstice. And there are lots of reasons for that. And I think in the Rethinking Christmas series that's on YouTube, you can hear me teach on that from many, many years ago. But uh, Constantine saw this season and he's thought, man, this is just out of control. And so he's the one who, under his leadership, instituted this idea of Christmas, or a day that we celebrate Jesus' birth. As we've talked about it for many times, in many ways, there's a lot of argument around it that whether that actually Jesus probably was born in more of a July, and it really doesn't make a difference to me. He probably wasn't born in the dead of winter in Jerusalem. That's pretty cold. It was probably in a more moderate time, but no one knows the exact date. But that's the day we commemorate it, and that's why in many ways it's placed on a day, a number, rather than by a season. So he put it on December 25th, and he created 12 days of basically observing this holy period, and it was meant to quell all of the rabble rousing that was going on at the time throughout Europe, and it brought people into a more observing space. Now, did it work? Did it not? It worked in the sense of it carved it out as a set apart period. Whether it worked or not in actually stopping the debauchery, I would argue that over time, culture and social change probably had influenced that just as much. Because as we know, after the fall of Rome, and in light of the fall of Rome, that Constantine Christianity didn't really take in the way we would have imagined. And on the other side of that, you have Gregory the Great instituting Benedictine spirituality, and then you have the launch of sort of Western Christianity in its full form. And by that time, you still had by the time actually, what is the date I wrote down? 480 is the earliest documented time we actually have of an Advent season. So not only did Constantine then put a 12-day period of Christmas, starting with Christmas Day, that were meant to be sort of a holy observance, but then by 480 we have evidence that there was a preparatory period that was helping them lead up to it. And as you know, the color of both Lent and Advent is purple. In Advent, it's also pink to symbolize Mary, but you can also you can use four purple candles as well. And in Lent, you only have in Lent you only have purple. There's no other color. But in Advent, you have and we'll talk about that third candle here in a second. But the idea is the reason they're both purple is to symbolize a season of waiting or preparation for Jesus. The purple being the royal color. And so both in Lent, which is meant to be a time of fasting, and Advent, which is meant to be a time of fasting, we don't really celebrate it that way anymore, and it's been kind of distorted in a lot of ways. But it's meant to be a time of waiting, of preparation. Advent means coming or arrival, like the idea that Christ is coming. And in the same way, we look back and we imagine the Jews in a time, and if you think about it just in terms of, as we've talked about Jewish history, you remember that you had the return to Jerusalem after the exile, and then they reestablished themselves, and then you have some 400 some odd years of of silence that came after that, and so there was this longing, there was this waiting. There were no prophets, there were no, and you have the period of rebellions and violence, and by force, the Jews were trying to reclaim their identity. The Maccabean revolts, and you leave it all the way up to the time of Christ. There still is that sense of waiting, and so as the Jews waited and still wait in that regard for the coming of the Messiah, because they reject Christ, we have that same sort of overlay, but we sort of superimpose our, I got this little, there you go, superimpose our waiting for Christ's return and the second coming into that sentiment of waiting for the baby, waiting for the incarnation, waiting for Christ to come back into the world in the same way Christ came into the world in the incarnation. So the Advent is a waiting or a waiting period for the experience of that incarnation. It always Advent dates, the season of Advent always dates 4 Sundays back from Christmas. So wherever December 25th falls, you take the first Sunday before that, and that becomes the fourth Sunday, and then you count back 4 Sundays. So sometimes that Sunday, and I think there are times where it can even fall into November, depending if Christmas falls just in the calendar in that way. Because it's this year, for example, like I feel like Advent just jumped out of the bushes and ambushed me, and I'm like, what? And I know that I had a funeral and everything. So, but it just it kind of surprised me, and I'm still haven't got my head back into the Advent season, because normally there's a lot of preparation. We get things ready in our home. We bring out Advent wreaths and things that sort of help us celebrate, and Advent candles. And we often get our tree after Christmas. So we have pink and purple lights we put on the tree. We really just in our family, I mean, I love the colors of the liturgical season because they condition us to think in a certain way. And I love that purple and that pink because it reminds me of the season we're in, that we're not in Christmas, that we're in this season of waiting, we're in this season of observation, we're in this season where we're really supposed to be disciplining ourselves and waiting. That doesn't mean we can't do all the cultural things, but in some sense, we still have that sense of waiting for the larger celebration. And in fact, in the Eastern Church, they call it the Nativity fast, and they actually use it as a pretty strict fast, so that when they have the 12 days of Christmas, it becomes like this huge feast time. But in general, the Eastern Church puts a lot more emphasis on the incarnation than other traditions. We've often said, I've said this before, the Eastern Church puts emphasis on the incarnation, on Christmas, and Epiphany for that matter, just the whole season. Roman Catholics put a lot of emphasis on the crucifixion, and that's why you see, go into a Catholic church, you see Jesus on the cross, the crucifix, that sense of penance, that sense of forgiveness, that sense of atonement is a huge part of the Catholic faith. And then in the Protestants' version of it, we like to emphasize resurrection and then new life and the growth, and so, which is why we have an empty cross. So we see that the Eastern Church has this huge celebration. It's called the Nativity Feast, and it doesn't even use the word coming or Advent. It actually is. It's paramount to it, but it's not actually, tantamount to it, but not actually. It doesn't really reflect the same period of waiting. It's more of a time of preparation for a celebration, because they see the incarnation as being the God becoming human, so that humans can become not God but divine. The divine becoming human, so human can be divine, and so it's that union. There's an emphasis on the union, and that's the first part of that, of Christ coming into the world, and then we then are taken out of this world in the physical form and have the reverse of that. By the time the Council of Tours of 567, you have a full-blown practice within Western Europe of fasting before Christmas. And so really, when we talk about Advent, as a practice of the church, you're talking going back to around 500. I mean, around the turn of the sixth century, you have this practice, and so you think about it, where you're like, well, that's 1,500 years old. Why doesn't everyone in the church do it? Well, evangelicals tend to jettison it because it seems like it's connected to Catholicism or it's connected to dead liturgy. And for me, I grew up doing it a little bit. We had the felt board, and we did devotions every night and a reading and lit the Advent candle and on Sundays. And I remember fond memories of that. And in fact, one of my earliest memories of the church was going to a craft night where we made Advent wreaths. I don't know why. I just remember I had to carry this. It was a wreath that was like I think it was baggies or something that we strung around some sort of hoop. And I remember spray painting it, and I remember having it on a hook and carrying, and I couldn't, and then we probably had glitter on. This is probably why I hate glitter. It was probably all over me or something, and I don't remember the trauma of it because I blocked it out. But I had to, I had to, I had to carry the glitter, the spray painted gold glitter plastic bag Advent wreath out of the sanctuary, out of the fellowship hall where we were going. But I have that memory of doing that, and so for me, it's such an important part of the season, and I've always wrestled with how to like balance Advent and the cultural celebrations around the Christmas season or the holiday season. But knowing that it goes back 1,500 years for me has been a really helpful thing and a very reinforcing in terms of my desire to do it, because it actually says this is a practice of the church. If they were doing it for 1,500 years, if they're observing it, if it's a time of preparation, it's probably a good thing. So I'll stop there for a second and see what you're all thinking before I move on. No? Anything? Questions? Thoughts?
Oh,
No? Okay. Some of the various practices um, um, for Advent as a whole. You probably, you know what? I was just, when we were in Detroit, we ran into Trader Joe's to get some holiday treats, and they always have these Trader Joe's Advent calendars that have 24 pieces of chocolate. And so we got my mom one, had Santa Claus on it. And it kind of made me feel gross, but it was the only one they had. But the notion of Advent as a season of waiting and a season of counting down and a season of moving towards Christmas has been something that has been caught on by secular culture without even knowing what the liturgical reason is. And so as I see these Advent, and they say right on them, Advent calendar, and I think to myself, you have lost, they have no concept that the Advent, probably people buying those, it's got 24 pieces of chocolate, it's a couple bucks, and they think, great, it's fun, it's countdown, but they really don't know what they're counting down to. And they know that it's the birth of the baby Jesus, but they really don't understand, they're not really conceptualizing the birth of baby Jesus as this majestic day of God's incarnation. And I think when you think about it and you frame Christmas not as sweet baby Jesus, not as, oh, here's the baby's born and in the manger and the story and the cozy animals. I mean, this is like the one of the most miraculous, phenomenological, supernatural things that we could possibly confess. And it really, and it's an extension of the story, obviously, of the Old Testament and the law and the prophets and leading up to this. But for us to express that is saying that we believe in the idea that there's something that is spirit, that is divine, that is outside, that is supreme, that can be incarnated in this world. In a material fallen way. I mean, Jesus' spirit wasn't fallen in the same way ours are, but his body was in the same fallen predicament of he was going to die. If Jesus wasn't crucified, like I said before, he would eventually age out. It wasn't like he had some super, life elixir or everlasting elixir. He would have eventually died as a human being, but that's not what he came for. He came to die the death. So this is that sense of the majesty of the incarnation, and we unfortunately see these Advent calendars lead up to it in a very common or banal way that really don't capture the essence of it. There are a lot of
it's the coming of Santa Claus in a lot of them, isn't it?
Probably more so. I mean, just the Christmas day in general. But yes, when Christmas has been co-opted by commercialism, and most people even amongst, I would say, if I had to make the guess amongst Western Protestant Christians, I think that the Orthodox don't view it this way, and I think as a part of their expression of their practices, they don't allow it to, like it would be, not that there aren't Orthodox that maybe have some emphasis on the gift side of it. I think Roman Catholics are probably 50, who knows what the percentage is, 50-50. I mean, it's probably, some do it, some don't, some are more, just like Catholics in general. You get people who are very observant of the Catholic feasts and fast days, and you get those who aren't. Uh, just kidding, Jim. Um, but but I think in the Protestant world, you're right. It's a countdown from it's like you get past the Thanksgiving Day weekend and then you get 24 pieces of chocolate before you get all of your gifts. And you have your family celebrations and your feasting. So some of it's still relevant, and I think the celebratory side is, but I think the emphasis or the focus has become so centered on what we get, or the celebration of just sort of family more than it is the really the genuine observance of the incarnation, which is one of the things that I love about the Jesse tree, is that it doesn't just sort of jump into the story at the time of Christ. It takes you through the whole Old Testament. Now, and it does it pretty quickly, but I think it's a reminder that as you prepare for the incarnation of Christ, that there was a lot that led up to that, and it wasn't just something that was thrown together.
Do the Jews today? I know, they think they're still waiting for the Messiah, but do they have annual kinds of I know they have few holidays. They don't celebrate Christmas, of course. So how do they have any ceremonies for?
Well, Hanukkah.
Yeah,
I mean,
but
not. I mean, not. I mean, I think Christmas is a pretty hard thing for Jews, and I would say in the same way, you have non-practicing Jews who just treat Christmas as Santa Claus and gifts and family and fun, and you probably have Jews who are like, the very name Christmas comes from the name of Christ, comes from this, and Christ is not necessarily Jesus's name; it's a title. But even that, they just sort of buy. I mean, they buy into it probably in the same way I think Christians buy into Halloween. They, and I've taught on Halloween before. I think it's a dark night. I think it's the high holy day of Satanists, and I don't personally think that Christians should be. I'm not judging Christians who do. It's their choice, and I think they're doing it somewhat innocently. But like for me and my family, we have not celebrated Halloween because I just don't want because it's not something that expresses a part of who we are.
right.
It doesn't contribute anything to the faith formation of my children, and if anything, it says, "Oh, it doesn't matter." Well, the high holy day of Satanists is not the day that I want to dress up and party and go out. And you might say, "Well, we're trivializing it," but you might also say, "Well, the very practice of dressing up in costumes was to allow spirits that don't have bodies to be embodied in the person, and basically for one night have sort of re-entry into the material world." And if that's the original thought of what the costumes were about, that's just not something it's not something I want to dabble with. And so in the same way, I'm sure there are places where Jews are like, you know what, this is about someone we don't believe as the Messiah. And maybe we just, so I think that is probably a point of tension. But I'm not Jewish. And just as much as there is a variety within Christianity, I'm sure there's a great variety of observance and rejection within Judaism as well. Advent devotionals, those are meant to guide. There's lots of them all over the place. You can find them to help you sort of walk through the season of Advent. There are I've talked about these in the past. There are antiphons, which usually follow the last 8 days before, or 8 days before Christmas Eve, where people will have these sung verses. They're usually in churches, and there are 7 nights where you sing between these phrases that go through the names of Jesus, like the root of Jesse, I don't even off the top of my head, I'm dropping all of them. Root of Jesse, the King of all kings, and so there's symbolism for that too. There's also chrism trees, which take all of these symbols. I'm sure you've seen if you've been ever part of a mainline church, you've seen a chrism tree, and usually it's a bunch of white ornaments on a tree. Have you seen those?
Yeah. Yes, I've seen them.
Yeah, in my Christian education time in the past, I've actually led churches in the process of making the chrismons and then decorating them. But the chrismons are a great way, and they all have symbolism there. All of these are techniques or methods or practices that people have used to sort of enhance the season, and they've grown over the years. The Advent candles is probably one of the larger staples, I think, for even those who may not do the all 24 days or longer, or do Advent devotions, or maybe decorate trees in that in a sort of liturgical way. Most churches who do observe Advent will have some sort of Advent wreath, and they have the four candles of hope, peace, joy, and love. And their first two are typically purple. The third one is typically pink. The joy candle is pink, and the final one is again purple. And then Christmas Day is a white candle. The hope is meant to sort of deal with the announcement and the promise of both Mary and Elizabeth. The peace, the second week, is dealing with John the Baptist. So this Sunday we'll sing a song about John the Baptist as one of our hymns. And it's meant to be sort of that call to preparation, even though it's out of sequence in the narrative. The third week, Joy Pink, is usually considered Mary Week, and so we sort of honor Mary in that, and the whole Magnificat in her prayer, and that she was chosen, and then the last candle is love, and I'm of the opinion personally that they should have done it differently, but that's just my opinion. I think it should go hope, joy, love, peace, because I think the peace should follow, but that's just Jason's opinion. And then obviously you have these 4 weeks that lead up to the time of Christmas Eve, where you would actually light the Christ candle, and then from that candle you'd spread the light, and that's when you have candlelit services and those sort of things. And so oftentimes in Advent, that Christmas Eve service is tied into it. It's that final celebration, and it is in many liturgical and Jewish traditions, the eve before is considered almost as if it's the vigil. So as you approach that hour of midnight, as soon as it hits darkness, it's considered part of the sort of celebration. So as we sing on Christmas Eve, the joy to the world, we're singing as if on that night sometime, in the darkness of that night, that Jesus was born. So really, Christmas starts in the eve of Christmas, not on Christmas morn. It's not when you wake up and get to get your gifts and go down to the tree and all that rigmarole. It really is meant to be the night. Just the 30-second aside would be, I've always said, celebrate the cultural things fully. Get your tree, get your stockings, do all those things. You can tie stockings to St. Nick's and other things, but do all those. Do all the parties, do all the Christmas gift giving. There's nothing wrong. The gift giving is more secular than it is Christmas anyways, so celebrate it and give gifts. Who cares? But it's when we try, and my feeling is but when we try to conflate the two and when we try to make Christmas the cultural celebration and Christmas the liturgical celebration all combined and conflated into one, we degrade the value and meaning of the incarnation. So Advent is a time that we prepare for that majesty, that miracle of the incarnation. I mean, and it's such an incredible one that we often overlook, that that's why I think I love the Jesse tree as much as I do. And then the last practice I just want to bring up would be the Jesse tree, which is what we're going to talk about today. And that came about, where did the first here's what I'll say. It's drawn from Isaiah 11, where it talks about the shoot of Jesse. And then there are two passages in Luke and in both Matthew, you have the stories of Christ's genealogy. And the genealogy, again, is meant to go back to David. And that comes both through Joseph and Mary, but Mary genetically through it. But it goes back from David, and it goes back to Nathan, and it goes back prior. And so, and then as we've talked about over the last month or so of the priest Melchizedek, it goes back to that line of that eternal king. Um, we have the earliest expression we have of the symbols or the stories or some expression of the shoot of Jesse, sort of capturing this image of this of the shoot, really goes back to about 1,000. So which I think is interesting. It's around the turn of, it was before the Great Schism, but if they have records going back to, so that, and chances are it probably was there before in some sort of local or individual practice. It might have been there, and you might not have records, but by 1,000, we know that they were using symbols. Now, that shouldn't surprise us. Again, as I've said many times, we had a largely illiterate culture till around the time of the Reformation, after the printing press was invented. And other than that, it would have been more nobility, and so the symbolism that was needed to communicate with people. This is why, again, they have church bells. They rang those bells, and they rang them for a long time, because they're reminding everyone in the little village it's time to come to church. You have no one had the Bible. They were only hearing the word from from the church or from the priest. And so you're there, and and then there are stained glasses, stained glass windows. There are illuminated manuscripts. There's all this symbolism that was normative for that period. So now we're like, oh, this is a symbol, and we think of it as something special. Well, that was the norm back then, because it was the only way they communicated. By the 12th century, we start to see the monk, her I don't even know how to say the name, quite frankly. Her I can't tell what I wrote actually. Hervés. In 12th century, there was a monk that basically took the Vulgate and took symbols from the Vulgate and turned them into sort of images. So the rod, or a star, or a tree. By the time the medieval period was in full effect, in the medieval period, they started using the tree in Italy as a sign of lineage. And I found this really interesting. Went a little rabbit trail. The very notion of lineage. So in other words, we think of a family tree. That's just normative for us. But in the 500s, that was probably not, or at least if what I read was not something that would really have been defined as clear cut. And so by the time you start to see this tree popping up, and it pops up in art in a lot of ways, and sometimes it's not even in a dramatic way that sort of has a swooping tree and you sort of feel like it's about lineage, but the tree would be placed there as in a religious painting as a reminder of this sort of long lineage. But by that time, that image of the tree had already been established as something related to heredity or genealogy. And what I thought was interesting is not only did it develop in Italy, and so in my head I'm thinking, well, what do Italian trees look like? They probably don't look that much different than ours, but that's just that greater sense of branching, that everything starts at a base and it still grows and it gets bigger and bigger in the branching out. But what I found fascinating about the whole thing was that this eventually moves from just a pure understanding of lineage, in particular religious lineage, and it eventually teases itself in our modern day times. You see it in biology, you see it in English where you do a grammatical tree, you see it in business where you do an organizational chart. When you think about the structures of things and smaller and subordinate things, you have a major trunk becomes the sort of core, and the farther out you go, it gets smaller and smaller. You flip that upside down, you put the boss up here, the CEO, and then it kind of tapers down here. You have a reverse tree or a root system or whatever. But the very idea of the tree as being a record or a track, or a hierarchy, or a path. It's meant to illustrate something. All goes back to this very early notion of a tree. So, and it has been since about the thousands something that has been used, and the images around those have developed and changed. So even within the Jesse tree being used as a liturgical element, or a catechetical element of Advent, although that came into play probably in the medieval period, there isn't any one sort of this is the set Jesse tree, but the very notion that these symbols then had something to hang them on. In fact, if you go into the manse and go into the other room, the family room on the first floor, we have a giant branch that sits across the top of our wall, and it's got two wood curtain hangers, and just sits in it. that's where we hang our Jesse tree ornaments, and it's gone with us forever. We actually picked it up from the woods when I was in seminary in Princeton, and went with us in the moving truck from New Jersey to Seattle to Western Pennsylvania to Louisville and here. And it suffered a few casualties amongst its limbs, but nonetheless, it still is up there and still holding true and strong. um,
Yeah. I
but
think every family finds, some way of celebrating if they're trying to be conscious about celebrating the season.
it is.
Like,
I agree. I mean, I didn't know about the Jesse tree really until seminary, and Shannon actually is the one who found it. I mean, although I grew up doing Advent devotions, when we cleaned my mom's house out this last spring, we had to decide what are we doing with this. It was a big burlap thing, and it had a big Christmas, regular Christmas tree on it, triangle looking one, and then we had the little felt pieces of all these cutouts of all of the different characters, and we put them up, and I remember wearing little pockets at the bottom, and you stick them in and play, and you have little sheep everywhere. And eventually the felt didn't work, and my mom glued little pieces of Velcro on it, which didn't also work. But anyway, all that's to say is, I think in celebrating anything intentionally, for me, the Jesse tree is just a a way to guide the process through the Advent season that captures each day. But even more importantly, I'm a strong proponent of regularly going through the narrative of Scripture, of
Mhm.
all of the major stories. I think a lot of people are like, oh, we heard this before. Oh, we know the stories, we know the orders, but maybe you do. Maybe you can put them together if we put them all in. But I think that the Jesse tree, when you have these symbols that are in some fashion, you start to say, I understand how these stories connect. I understand how they go from one to the next. And for me, the continuity of those stories has been so significant. And I want my children to have an awareness of that continuity of the story. What better way to tell the whole narrative story than through some sort of pictorial representation? Um,
Jason,
yeah.
the other thing that struck me recently is Matthew's gospel starts with that whole long genealogy.
Yes.
There must be a reason that is the beginning, and then it repeats again in Luke.
It
And
does.
I think it emphasizes that it's important to trace some of that history.
Well, you got to realize for two reasons. One, in Matthew, it's pretty detailed. And the
Yeah.
reason I would agree, but scholars in general think the reason that Matthew probably contained that is, again, Matthew's written to the Jews. And so
Right.
first century Christians, they're trying to say this isn't just some rando JC who popped up and is claiming to be the Son of God. This is the fulfillment of the prophecy. And we're going to demonstrate right from the beginning, before we jump even into this, that this is where Christ came from and how he's connected to the line of Jesse, or to the line of David, which Jesse goes back prior to David, obviously, and in fact to Obadiah, to Ruth and Boaz, and so you trace this back, and you keep going back farther. Again, the idea is you want to connect the lineage. So um, we see we see it a lot in you see the presence of Jesse trees in illuminated manuscripts. You see it usually as a tree, and there are these symbols. And again, there's no standardization. You see it in all. You can type in Jesse tree stained glass, and throughout history, there are all sorts of them through all different cultures and countries that have stained glass and more liturgical expressions of religion. You see it in carvings. For years, I've wanted to do a carving. One of these days, I want to do like a round. I want to take a log and do it all around the edge. But we'll see if I ever do it. Lots of paintings, mosaics, other forms of media that have come about that have sort of expressed this notion of the Jesse tree. As I said, in terms of just the Advent in general, I wanted to show you two things. One, we have this ring that we use in our family around Christmas, and actually they comes in different parts, so you can use it to do for the days of Lent too, so you can have 40. But basically, you can make a various sized circles. I don't know if I have the two parts to go together, and then you have for Christmas or Advent, you have Mary on a donkey, and then for Lent, there's Jesus carrying a cross. If you look carefully, you'll see that Louis Louis also liked Mary a lot, and so
Oh,
um,
Of
so.
course.
But again, it's a way of counting. It's a way of sort of seeing the story unfold, and you put a candle in each one, you see it growing. Um, like I said, we've done this for many, many years, and I'll just show you a couple of them. And if you're over here at Christmas, you can see more of them. But we, many, many years ago when I was in seminary, we painted ours. So we went to the Joann Fabrics or whatever the craft store was and got these little wood inserts and cut them down. And this was happened to be a tree one, so that's the tree of Adam and Eve. Here's the world. Um, and then I'll show you the third one. And we have one of these for every 24, all 20, actually 25 days. But this is one of our favorites, the snake. Um,
Oh, cool.
so I mean, there's lots of ways. So that was our early attempt at doing them. When we were in New Wilmington, I think it was New Wilmington or Louisville, maybe I'm not sure now that I say that. I again took to just as an expression of some my own fooling around on the computer, but I made shrinky dinks, and so I took some of the
Uh-huh.
images. You'll notice they morphed because you'll see this is a version of that. And so I took these
Oh, yeah.
images and I dropped them on in another file and made them into sort of a stained glass thing. And so, but you have the different stories again represented. Here's the apple, looks like the same apple, but it's got little
Mm.
color things around it. And we just colored them and then shrunk them down. And we've given these as gifts to people in terms of we give them the whole thing of we buy shrinky dinks like in packs of 100 sheets. But when the light hits them behind that, I don't really have a way to show that.
Right.
It kind of illuminates it like a stained glass window, like this.
Oh, right. Oh,
So
cool.
so this very idea, again, there's the boat doubled over. You can see the similarity. This
Mm.
idea is we hang all of these. We have Jesse tree symbols all over our house. We have the ones that we do each year. Shannon has a separate one for Silas that he does. We have a calendar. We always hang these as well. And really, the idea behind it is I want in every way, shape, and form opportunities for myself and particularly my children to be able to engage and see these symbols that remind them of the stories of Scripture. So, in other words, Advent doesn't just become a time of waiting, it becomes a time of intentional catechesis for our families to say, this is who we are. Every Christian, in my opinion, should be able to tell the narrative scope of the Bible. And I would say that I think the vast majority probably could not. And I think that's a challenge and a problem. But every Christian should be able to say, this is what happened at the beginning there. Then you have then you have Noah, and then you have Abraham, and you have Isaac and Jacob and Moses, and down the line, and be able to put these. And this is the most simple way, the most guaranteed way that every year you have a chance to go through these narratives. All right, I'm going to
Mhm.
stop there in terms of my what time is it? We'll see if we can get through all eight of these. But any other comments or thoughts before we start some of these readings? I know I'm talking a mile a minute. Sorry about that. I've had too much coffee today.
But
Um,
that was kind of the Old Testament style of passing on their traditions too. Fathers telling them to their children, and
Absolutely.
it was a storytelling kind of method of tracing their history.
And if the children can associate the story of Scripture with a symbol, when they see those symbols in religious art, when they see it in stained glass, when they see it in, pictures in their Bible, it's meant to, if your whole life you're just exposed to that, those things are meant to sort of draw you in. Obviously, if you see the ark, you think of Noah's Ark, but do we think of Noah's Ark? We often think of Noah's Ark like the nursery one, where it's all, rainbowy and sunshiny and everyone's happy. Whereas, like I like to joke that Noah's Ark should be like uh, dark and dreary and rainy and dead bodies floating everywhere out the ark and everyone angry at each other because, there were too many animals and but it's a story of redemption. And the symbol of the ark means something, and the rainbow means something, and the the dove means something, and they all have the incredibly. The story of Noah's Ark has all these incredible symbols about it that even in a smaller sense of the narrative that we don't think about, we don't talk about, we don't embrace. I want Silas to think about the ark not as just a story of God destroying the earth, but as a story of God's redemption, of a story of God's faithfulness. So in each of these, you see God's faithfulness in a new way, and we'll talk about those as we go along. I know you don't have this with you. This is on the website, lakecitypresbyterian.org, last week, and I'll post it on this week's one as well, probably tomorrow or Friday or something. But you'll be able to you could find in the last 3 years I've posted these the same ornaments as well. And again, they're the same ones we use in our home. They're the same ones that are on the Shrinky-Dinks. It doesn't make a difference to me. For me, it's just the reminder of the story, and that sort of setting aside time to say, I'm going to read this passage, which is what we're going to do now, unless anyone else has anything else they want to add.
Nope.
Maybe we'll just go through the first page today, because next week we won't have to talk about. All right. Well, I'll start by reading, and here's what I want to encourage you to do. I know you don't have these with you, but if you have a piece of paper, or if you just, have something you can jot down on and stick it on your phone, I don't really care. But as I as I read these chapters, and we can take turns reading if you want, but as I read these chapters, just listen for the sense of God's presence and God's faithfulness. Because the story of salvation in redemption history is a story of God's faithfulness to an unfaithful people. And you don't obviously see the unfaithfulness just yet in the story, but as it unfolds, you can see the unfaithfulness of people and God's continual renewal of covenants and God's commitment, recommitment to the people of Israel. So the first symbol is not just a sun, but is often a sun and a moon, and it's not like a yin and a yang type thing, but it's meant to remind us of the creation, of God's governance, of God's providence, as we've talked about in my Celestial Beings series, that the sun and the moon by Jewish traditions were looked at as actual entities or spirits or celestial beings that governed the day and the night, and God put them in place for the purposes of our light and our warmth and our growth of the earth. But let me go ahead and read the first chapter of it, and it's 31 verses. So, if anyone has anything that they hear, then write it down. And if you want to stop me in the middle because you want to say something, that's fine too. Just shout out. So this is Genesis 1 through 31. When God began to create the heavens and the earth was chaos. The darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning the first day. And God said, "Let there be a dome in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." So God made the dome and separated the waters that were under the dome from the waters that were above the dome, which I think is an interesting thing. And so it was. And God called the dome sky, and there was evening, and there was morning the second day. And God said, "Let the waters under the sky be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And so it was. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. And God said, "Let the earth put forth vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees of every kind on the earth that bear fruit with a seed in it." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed of every kind, and trees of every kind bearing fruit with a seed in it. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning the third day. And God said, "Let there be light in the dome of the sky to separate the day from the night." And here's where we get our symbol. "And let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years. And so you see God there giving us history, and God giving us time, and God giving us a way to gauge our sense of existence on this earth. And let there be lights in the dome of the sky, and let the light and to give light on the earth. And so it was, and it was so. God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night and the stars. And again, that goes back to that Hebrew word rule. It points to the idea of actual celestial being governing and ruling, and what's where we get that idea of celestial nature of the universe. And God set them in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the fourth day. And God said, let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the dome of the sky. So God created the great sea monsters, and every living creature that moves, every kind with which the waters swarm, and every winged bird of every kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters and the seas, and let the birds multiply on the earth. And there was evening, and there was morning, the fifth day. And God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures of every kind, cattle and creeping things, and wild animals of the earth, and every kind. And it was so. God made the wild animals of the earth, every kind, and the cattle of every kind that creeps, and everything that creeps upon the ground of every kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, let us make humans in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. So God created humans in his image. In the image of God he created them, male and female he created them. God blessed them. God said to them, be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. God said, see, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit, and you shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird in the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food. And it was so. God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. All right.
I am listening.
Anything you want to say or think or suggest or talk about? Sorry, my brain's not working tonight.
You're okay.
It's the start of everything.
It is. And you see God's faithfulness in that, and God's plan, God's provision, God's, the unfolding of the universe. And I think in an evolutionary sense, you see billions of years of evolution. I know that there are New Earth folks who want to say that God just created, and it's not, and I understand in many ways why they've believed that. That there was sort of breathed into existence, and there's a majesty behind that. But I also think that there's nothing in this passage that contradicts an evolutionary process, so long as you understand that the process came through God's might and power and design. So we have this symbol on December 1st, the very first day of Advent, of the creation of the world. I think you could pair this with John 1 of the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, in that sense of the presence of God in all things. Anything else? Anyone want to comment on anything? Anything you heard? No?
Nope.
Nope.
And we don't have to read, and I'll say this. We can read through these, and if it's you can also read through them yourselves if you prefer not to. I don't have to read the whole chapters, but I I don't want you to feel like you're just sitting there listening. But unless it's formative, I can cut some of these down. But let's read the second one. So you go to the apple, and the major part of the story, the whole reason Christ came. according to the historical theologians, was for the purposes of redemption, of what happened on that fateful day that our first parents partook of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And sometimes people will symbolize the second day with a serpent. Sometimes it's an apple. Sometimes it's a tree, as I showed you in the one where there was an apple or a tree, and then there was one of the serpent. That was an earlier version where it was separated, and there was another story that wasn't taken out. But you'll see a lot of these symbols. But even that picture of a fruit, or the picture of a serpent around a tree, or that picture of just the tree as a whole. I mean, those are all things that again remind, and again, maybe we shouldn't be, sort of ignore the metaphor of the idea that that through a tree the world has fallen, and through a tree that the root of a tree in Jesse, you see all leading up all the way to basically Christ's crucifixion on a tree. And so there's lots of symbolism of that wood and the tree. Okay, well, Genesis 3 says this, and again, jump in here if you want. If you hear something, just jump in. This is Genesis 3. Now the serpent was more crafty than any other wild animal that God had made. And he said to the woman, "Did God say, 'You shall not eat from any tree in the garden?' And the woman said to the serpent, 'We may eat of all of the fruit of the trees in the garden. But God said, You shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the middle of the garden, nor shall you touch it, or you shall die.' But the serpent said to the woman, 'You will not die, for God knows that when you eat, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good from evil.'" Just pause here. That also tells us that there was good and evil prior to the Garden of Eden, and even in the sixth day, that there was some sense of darkness or evil. And for some, that chaos that God created in was the darkness. In the darkness, as it was separated, this darkness was being bound in the expression or the creation of light. There were boundaries of that darkness. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was delight to the eyes, and there was tree to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. And she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. And then their eyes were both opened, and they knew they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made loincloths for themselves. Now, I've said this time and time again, I don't think Adam and Eve were ashamed of their nakedness. I think that's kind of, like all of a sudden to be ashamed of your genitalia, or every picture of in history, or not every picture from the puritanical period on, but you have Eve behind some leaves so you don't see her breasts, because we make those more sexual than we do actually biological features that feed children. But you see a lot, I mean, you can trace all this stuff through the history of art and the unfolding of this, but the very notion that they were ashamed from their naked is something that I've sort of wrestled with, the idea that why would they care that they were naked? Except for the fact that maybe, this goes back to my metaphysical theory, that they were not actually physical material beings that died, that they were some different type of metaphysical nature that had existence. Maybe it was more like Jesus's resurrected body, and he experienced the elements differently. But the nakedness, the feeling of nakedness, was shame, because they went from a place of not being incarnated to a place of being incarnated. And if all of a sudden you were dropped into the earth and you were naked, you'd feel the wind, you'd feel the temperature, you'd feel the heat, you'd feel the cold, you'd walk on the ground, you'd feel the ground under your feet maybe in a different way. So that sense of embodiment brings about a sense of realization. And so the nakedness is not about their their genitalia. The nakedness is about their realization of that they have too been made a part, or become part of this physical material world. Loincloths for themselves, again, I don't understand why that would be an issue. No other mammalian creature in the created order, and we are mammals, tries to cover their junk. They don't need to, because it doesn't matter. But we, for some reason, feel, and I think that's a puritanical overlay. I think that's a recognition. I think that is, by the time this stuff was written, and it was inspired by, theoretically Moses, or God inspired Moses to write it, you have thousands of years of human history, potentially up to that time. And so they're at that point, they realize the challenges, and the in both the pleasures and woes of sexual contact. So I think that there's some sense of overlay too. And again, it goes back to the fact that I don't, other words, why I don't understand the whole point. I mean, you go into tribal nations around the world today, and there is, everyone's their stuff is hanging out, and it's not that big of a deal because they haven't over sexualized it. And so I think that there's some overlay of that, but that's just Jason's opinion.
But isn't it also that they needed to cover themselves just as a way to hide? If
Yeah.
they felt guilt. I mean, anytime someone feels guilt, they hide their face. A child that is caught doing something wrong,
Yep.
they try to hide. It's more the hiding than the shame or anything, I think.
Yeah, and I think that in this next part in 8, 9, and 10, you get the sense of hiding more than you do. Like there's a sense of nakedness. And again, I think that more like, yeah, maybe they did make leaves and loincloths and things to cover themselves because they were cold, not because they were ashamed. And that, I mean, they probably was some shame involved in it because they realized they've been incarnated or because but that sense of awareness, because I mean, I think that preloads the idea that, sexuality is as a wrong. I mean, their eyes were opened and they could see, they know the difference between good and evil. Well, why does that have to do with nakedness? Unless you
Mm.
unless you are suggesting that naked in and of itself is wrong. But then within a marital relationship, the nakedness would be meant to be normalized and not wrong. So, you could say, well, maybe that's a reversal of the curse, but that was still there even in the Old Testament, and God hadn't given them provisions to reverse of that curse. There was sense that, you know, I think that it was exposure, you know. But anyway, you go into verse 8. They heard the sound of the Lord walking in the garden at the time of the evening breeze. I think it's interesting that they talk about breeze again, chilly skin. And the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord among the trees of the garden. But the Lord had called the man and said, "Where are you?" As if he didn't know. And said, "I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked and I hid myself." You could also say because I, was physically incarnated in this world and I could feel the elements of this world and I hid myself. And he said, "And who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree from which I had commanded you not to eat?" And the man said, "The woman who you gave to be with me, she gave me the fruit." So there's blame shifting now. And I ate. And then the Lord said to the woman, "What is this you have done?" And the woman said, again, blame shifting, "The serpent tricked me, and I ate." And the Lord said to the serpent, "Because you have done this, cursed are you among all animals and among all wild creatures. Upon your belly you shall go." And that's why I often think that maybe the serpent had some arms and legs, and they had some amputations or some mortifications into a different type of being. "Upon your belly you shall go, and the dust you shall eat, and all the days of your life." There's the sense of time and history, and dust being the material world. "I'll put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers, and he will strike your head, and you will strike his heel." And again, we as Christians reinterpret that as the earliest prophecy of Christ and the reversal of the curse that just happened. To the woman, he said, "I'll make your pangs and in childbirth exceedingly great," which means that there were pains probably before, and just a discomfort, but maybe not, and why those pangs, were there. And maybe that's just because, again, the physical side of it, you're feeling it. Maybe if they were incarnated, the physical side of it brought them into that. "In the pain you shall bring forth children, and then yet your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you." Enter, in my opinion, sexuality and patriarchy. And it was, say, "Oh, that's horrible to say that God divinely ordained that." And I know that this has been used probably to justify patriarchy and misogyny and sexism throughout the history of the church in very evil and nefarious ways. But I do think there's something about the nature of desire in ruling or domination, and that could also be understood in a physical form. Why do men
But
rule?
Jason,
Yeah,
don't you think that it was written by patriarchal men?
100%.
So their inflection of that is going to influence it, or their
100%. But then and I 100% agree with you. But you also but that's that tenuous balance between how do you say that it was divinely inspired? Jews would hold Genesis, hold the Torah as being God given, verbatim. I don't necessarily hold that myself, but that sense of yes, it was written thousands of years later when patriarchy had already established itself, and it was meant to describe what had happened, and is meant to sort of express itself in metaphoric ways, also, and and the balance between the metaphor and the literal interpretation of this. You could put all sorts of traditions in the Christian faith on that spectrum. I don't see necessarily as these things as having to be exact, but I do see them as pointing towards something. And now that men justifying the patriarchy they had over women, perhaps. But even in a biological sense, Jim, let's just say you strip away the notion of who we are in terms of our rational beings. In most mammalian expressions of species, males are larger, physically dominant, and they physically dominate women. And in a world where there is constant threat of someone taking from you, it's survival of the fittest, though, and you survive by power, not by having a good conversation, but by physical domination. And so in any framework you want to put it, whether God ordained it or not, those who are most powerful, and this happens amongst men, take women out of the picture in general. You have big, powerful men, they'll dominate over weaker men. And you put that in there, and you can trace this back. There's actually a book called Roots of Power, and it's a great book that sort of explores primate behavior throughout history and recognizes that these patterns exist there. If you are a stronger man, or and you could say too, you could have a strong woman and a weak man, but then the stereotype or the prototype or the archetype would be a strong man, and you would say the woman is symbolizing the role of the strong man. But in any system of biology, you're going to have survival of the fittest, and what allows you to survive as a species, and in the case for humans, is that one can dominate over the other to provide safety. And if you don't have that sense of safety, then, you go back and you can study biology and you say, well, why do women then desire men and why do men desire women? Well, the propagation of the species, obviously, but women desired men who were stronger and built like gladiators, not the skinny guy. We live in the era of nerds are cool. That wasn't like that 6,000 years ago. You wouldn't go to the weak guy who couldn't protect you. You'd go to the strong guy who can protect you. And that propagates then children who are bigger, stronger, and because you're building safety. Because this is the fallen world. It's a world that constantly is threatening your well-being. And so even if you don't look at it from the religious perspective, you still have some understanding of, I think there still would be a sense of not patriarchy, but male dominance. Now, saying that, I like this passage because I think it also introduces the very notion of sexuality. I do not think sexuality existed in the same way we understand it prior to the fall. I don't know what it was, but the very fact that God says your desire shall be for your husband. Now, many feminists have interpreted this as your desire shall be for your husband because she had more power than he did. And so the woman was given this sort of elevated role, but because she overstepped, then the roles were reversed. Now, I mean, it's all mythology. You could interpret that in any way you want, but I do think both in terms of patriarchy, you see some sort of establishment, and it's kind of tough thinking about it as a divine establishment, but it could be the very fact that if you were incarnated into the world into a physical being where men were larger than women and had more physical power than women, that rule would exist there as is, just in the physical sense. But the desire for a man, I think, is that sexuality that says, hey, there's something that was brought into the world in the fall, because you don't see cows, other mammals, even apes and primates, they don't have a sense of sexuality. They have a sense of instinctual reproduction. And differentiating between those things is important because our sexuality largely comes from our brain and our rationality, and the perversion or the degradation of that sense of what was in a pure sense, but in the sense of the minute you enter that sense of self-gratification or self-preservation or self-desire, you take it out of that natural feature of how we express ourselves. And what you see in
Jason,
that, yeah.
why do we need to apply that in today's world where the men and the women should be equal?
Well, but that's why it's important to understand that, because when we say that the Spirit came, that was reversed. The fall, the curse of the fall was reversed in Christ and the advent of the Spirit. That's why it's
I got
important
you.
to me,
That's good.
intergenerationality all the way through from the time. I mean, this, we're just 2,000 years later, finally starting to get some things right. This is why equity
Yeah.
and equality, and this is why intergenerationality is so important, because the very things that divide us on this earth, whether it be strength or whatever, are no longer, they no longer matter, because it goes back to the whole thing I've been preaching for my entire time here, is that this world is not our own. These are not our bodies. These are
Yeah.
things that are
Yeah.
temporary.
And
So
I've always looked at this passage as this was your punishment, not the way God meant it to be. None of this was how it was designed to be originally. Now there will be pain. Now there will be suffering and hard work and struggle and toil and male dominance. And that's punishment. That's not a norm. I mean, I think for centuries that was set up as, oh, that's how God designed it to be. No, that was punishment.
it was punishment, and it was a curse by God.
Right.
And
Exactly.
that's what makes Pentecost so important,
Right.
is because Christ goes to the woman at the well, and Christ says, and Christ says, "Let the little children come unto me." And you have to have faith of a
Mhm.
child. And what Christ is doing is saying, this physical world that you have been dominated by and trapped in. I mean, this is, it goes back to, there's hierarchy in everything in the world. But did God intend
Yeah.
it? No. I mean, God said, "Here's my image." I mean, that image was distorted and taken out of the context of the garden, and good and evil then were given to to humans to sort of ascertain for themselves. Well, if your mentality is self-preservation and against all the things that I've just talked about, then sexuality was also going to be a part of self-preservation and also self-gratification. There's that sense of self in it. And we look to the pre-Adam and Eve, the pre-fallen Adam and Eve, and you get that sense again of perichoresis, of that equitable dance, of that equality that existed between men and women prior to the fall.
Yeah.
Not that there wasn't still order, but that order wasn't a dominion or a domination. It was a partnership. So, and then I'll go
Okay.
on. What's that?
I said, thank you. Okay.
I know I'm going probably too far into this, but rabbit trail. Uh,
Yeah.
And then he said to the man, "Because you have listened to the voice of your wife, and you have eaten of the tree about which I have commanded you, you shall not eat it. And cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat of the plants of the field." Again, this is the first shift from plants of the tree, the seed-bearing plants, to the plants of the field. And one God gave with freedom, the other humans had to cultivate and work and labor in order to bring about. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, and you shall return to until you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken. You are dust, and to dust you shall return. And against is that fragility, that mortality, that connection to the ash or the dust of the earth. And I love that it says you shall eat bread, because if you don't take this verse into consideration when you look at Jesus as the bread of life, then it doesn't make sense. This is
Yeah.
this, the curse was, you're going to work for your food, and you're going to die even though you're eating it. And you're just going to work into yourself to, to the bone, trying to survive. But in the end, it doesn't matter, because I'm going to free you from this death. I'm the bread of life. I replace the bread of death. Man named his wife Eve because she was the mother of all living things, and God made garments of skins for man and for his wife and clothed them. And I think that, in my opinion, I think that it could also be a verse that lends itself to the idea of the skins of the earth, or the skins of the garments of skin. We have skin on us. And then the Lord said, "See, the human beings have become like one of us." Again, the plurality of God. I didn't say it before, but let us make them in our image. They become one of us. There's a plurality existing in this chapter, and very early in the Bible, letting us know that God has a plural nature, knowing good and evil. And now they might reach out their hands and also take from the tree of life and eat it and live forever. Therefore, the Lord God sent them forth from the Garden of Eden to the till the ground from which they were taken. He drove them out He drove out the humans into the east of the Garden of Eden. He placed a cherubim and a sword flaming and turning to guard the way to the tree of life. Um, so you have this. Here you go. You have this grand notion of creation, and then you have this grand notion of the fall. Do you want to do one more, or are we out of time?
We can do one more.
Let's do one more. We'll go to Genesis 8. Any comments while I pull it up? Thoughts? So we see in this story God's faithfulness. In other words, and we see that in the curse of the serpent, that someday this will be reversed. And we see that obviously in the Pentecost, but we see, so this is kind of one of the downer stories, but we also see God's promise of redemption, that the reign of the serpent, the impact of the serpent won't always be there. So, but as you know, creation, Adam and Eve, they go out, they live hundreds of years. God's still not pleased. Cain and Abel, you see the entrance of sin, and the presence of sin in the world, and of selfishness. You see the sacrificial system. You see the sense of othering, and of dissonance in humanity and brokenness of humanity. You see all that wrapped up in Cain and Abel. There are lots of stories in between that we could add into this. If you wanted to make a longer one, you could do the Tower of Babel in that. Some of them use that. But in this version that we have here, it takes us up to into Noah and to the renewal of the Noahic covenant. And we pick it up when the flood subsides. So you all know the story of what happened, and then they've been on the ark for the better part of a year, and now that they're finally done, they're finding their way back to the land. And it says in verse 8, or 8 verse 1, but God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and all the domestic animals that were with him on the ark. Thank goodness he remembered. And God made a wind that blew over the earth, and the waters subsided, and the fountains of the deep and the windows of the heavens were closed, and the rain from the heavens were restrained, and the waters gradually receded from the earth. And at the end of 150 days, the waters had abated. And the seventh month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. And the waters continued to abate until the 10th month, and on the 10th month, on the first day of the month, the tops of the trees of the mountains appeared. So, they were still waiting, the water's going down. At the end of the 40 days, Noah opened the window of the ark that he had made and sent out the raven, and it went to and fro into the waters until the waters were dried up from the earth. And he sent out the dove from him to see if the waters had subsided from the face of the ground. But the dove found no place to set its foot, and it returned to him in the ark, for the waters were still on the face of the whole earth. So he put out his hand and took it and brought it in the ark with him. He waited another 7 days, and again he sent out the dove from the ark, and the dove came back to him that evening, and in its beak was a freshly plucked olive leaf. So Noah knew the waters had subsided from the earth. And then he waited another 7 days, just for good measure, and sent out the dove, and it did not return to him any more. In the 600th, in the 601st year, in the first month, or the first day of the month, the waters were dried up from the earth, and Noah removed the covering from the ark, and looked and saw that the face of the ground was drying. In the second month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth was dry, and God said to Noah, go out from the ark, you and your wife and your sons' wives with you. Bring out with you every living thing that is with you, all of the flesh, birds and animals, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, so that they may abound in the earth and be fruitful and multiply on the earth. So Noah went out with his sons and his wife and his sons' wives, and every animal and every creeping thing and every bird and everything that moves on earth went out of the ark by families. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and took every clean animal and every clean bird, and offered a burnt offering on the altar. And when the Lord smelled the pleasant odor, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of the humans, for this inclination of the human heart is evil from youth, nor will I ever destroy a living creature as I have done. As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night, and day and night shall not cease. So there you go, chapter 8, pointing to the promise of never destroying again. And if you go on into chapter 9, it talks about he renews that Noahic covenant. renews the Adamic covenant in the Noahic covenant where he says, "Be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth." And again, it's that design that's the one of the biggest arguments for the diversity of the earth and for not a monolithic culture. And when God brought everyone together, when they gathered together at the Tower of Babel, God sent them out and said, "No, I want you to spread out. I want you to diversify. I want you to fill the earth. I want you to multiply." God's watching the project unfold, and He doesn't want everyone to sort of gather around one place. So. Thoughts?
That's just why I don't understand people being against diversity today.
Well, honestly, because they're base humans who fear that which they do not know.
Yeah.
And that is a human fear. You know what? You walk down, if you're in Chicago and you're walking down the street and you see, dark figures. I mean, I'm not even saying someone of a person of color. It could be anyone. It could be, but you just see a group of, again, going back to the size. You see a bunch of small people coming down, you feel less threatened. You see some large people, you're like, oh, I need to be on guard. Well, that's fear. That's anxiety because it's the unknown. You don't know what's going to happen. There's some sense of threat. There's some sense of fear. And as a natural human, incarnated, depraved sense of like, oh no, I'm being threatened. And so there's fear. And I think some people say that which I do not know is that which I fear. And there are those who, if you've only been raised in one environment with no other diversity, then everything around you can be a place of fear. Now, the only way you can overcome that is by engagement and genuine I-thou type engagement, which is why I think that over time, we're seeing things unfold, but I think sometimes we forget. In this day and age, we want everything like this. If the internet's too slow, we get mad. But we forget that human history has unfolded over thousands of years, and the changing of the way we think and understand and respond and live our lives is something that it's a very slow process. And the older you get, the more difficult it is to sort of change.
So it's a learned fear, though, too.
Yes, it's both innate and learned, but learned for good reason. Because no one walked around in the jungle willy-nilly when a tiger could jump out and grab you. You walk around with a sense of fear and a sense of caution because there's threat in the world. This is why when there's no longer sin and there's no longer fear, there's no longer predatory, everything is self-giving, you can live in a place without fear, without concern, without anxiety. All right. Any final thoughts?
Nope.
We didn't get very far, but we'll cruise through the next few as we talk about the narratives. Maybe I'll tighten up the readings a little bit for next week, so we're not reading the whole thing. I put the chapters in here just to make it easier, so you're not getting like a piece; you get the whole pericope. But this way, But if you haven't downloaded these, I'd encourage you to.
Yeah,
And
we'll do that.
They have days. We're on the 4th, so we got up to today's. We didn't do today's, but you can carry on, and then in the next week, if you continue on with these, next week we won't have to read through them as much. We can just reference them because we'll all sort of walk through the passage already. But it's that great place where we can, talk about the narratives. Again, God's faithfulness in creation, God's faithfulness despite the fall, God's faithfulness to, although He destroyed, still to save and to renew and to reestablish and to promise never and to give assurance that God would never destroy the earth again. And then we see again next week as we talk about what the message of today is. This is Abraham and the camel. The camel represents Abraham. Sometimes they use other symbols, but God's faithfulness again to say, I'm not going to destroy the whole earth. I'm going to actually use a people. I'm going to establish a people that can be a beacon of light and a people of salvation for the world. So we'll look at that next week. Again, that's all about God's presence, about salvation history, about the way God was faithful to the Israelites despite their unfaithfulness that we'll see throughout this whole thing. So, all right,
Very
folks. Good stuff.
Thank you.
This is why I love
All right.
Advent.
Thank you.
We'll see you next
Yeah.
week. I'll see you
Thanks,
Sunday.
Al.
Okay.
We'll have service on Sunday. We'll see you Sunday, if not sooner.
All
Okay.
right.
All right. Thank
Take
you.
care.
Thank
Blessed
you.
Advent. Bye-bye.
You too.